You've obviously got artificial intelligence in every conversation at this point in time, and capabilities that represents to drive efficiency and automate some processes. But I would also argue, when I think about real transformation at this point in time, I think about the blocking and tackling that we aren't doing well. Things like family health history, automating that to a better extent so we're not filling out the same paperwork every time we go to a physician's office. How do we get a better grip around staffing? How do we address their care needs better, and how do we start to align their issues truly are and really evolve into a more efficient care process? I think we've, as an industry, kind of hyped up the word transformation to such an extent that I don't know if we as an industry know what it truly means right now.
Welcome back to Beyond the Bedside, the podcast where we explore the leadership, innovation, and human stories shaping the future of healthcare. Today's guest is Mark Hallman, a healthcare strategist, transformation executive, and innovation leader whose career has spanned some of the most influential health systems, including the Cleveland Clinic, JPS Health Network, Centura Health, and now as managing partner of AEM Partners. Mark has built a reputation for helping healthcare organizations navigate complexity from operational transformation and value-based care strategy to digital innovation, ambulatory expansion, physician alignment, and community-centered healthcare development. What makes Mark's perspective especially unique is his ability to bridge big-picture strategy with operational execution. He's led initiatives involving billion-dollar campus redevelopment projects, clinically integrated networks, digital health frameworks, AI-driven strategy, and consumer-centered healthcare models, all while staying grounded in the realities healthcare leaders face every day. In today's conversation, we'll explore what healthcare transformation actually requires, how innovation can improve both access and outcomes, and why the future of healthcare leadership may depend on our ability to rethink the systems we've always accepted. Mark, welcome to Beyond the Bedside.
Thank you so much, Michael, and I appreciate the intro.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to have you on the show. And today I thought that we could start by discussing what real healthcare transformation looks like and how we can move beyond theory into, practical system-wide transformation. So let's start with how healthcare organizations talk constantly about transformation, right? They're always buzzword on almost every call I'm with on leadership. But what do you think separates real transformation from simply rebranding existing problems?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, multiple layers to this. And, a lot of my thought process in this form and fashion goes back to even, how much the industry has changed in the last 26 years, and I often start to think about what is the industry going to look like in the next 25 years? Who do my kids deal with? What does this industry look like at 2050? And, I also circle back to, if we go back to early 2000s and, all the hype then was about electronic medical records and everybody was on electronic medical record. So much of the environment was automated. I would argue, where are we at today with electronic medical records? How many organizations truly have a deployed electronic medical record and are using it to its fullest extent and able to pay for it? So you look at the pressures that have come into this industry in a relatively short period of time. And then you start to think, okay, well, what do we do differently and now to truly say it's transformational? And you've obviously got artificial intelligence in every conversation at this point in time. And, the capabilities that represents to drive efficiency and automate some processes. Obviously, that's extremely intriguing and, is here to stay. But I would also argue, when I think about real transformation at this point in time, I think about the blocking and tackling that we aren't doing well, and things like family health history, automating that to a better extent so we're not filling out the same paperwork every time we go to a physician's office. I think about how do we as an industry evolve past just clinical transformation and clinical evolution to a business evolution, right? How do we get a better grip around staffing? My wife's a nurse practitioner, and in some organizations, their schedules are locked in 6 months out. And the ability to take time off is extremely critical or extremely hard to do. And they're a very overburdened, stressed out group, much like many of our physicians. And so, I start to think of real transformation as how do we make a more business-centric healthcare institution or system, and how do we evolve beyond so many sunk costs and things that we take for granted or things that we assume to be normal year after year, and start to really operate like a business, understand the consumer to a better extent, so that we can really prepare things differently. And then as those consumers come into our network, how do we address their care needs better? And how do we start to align where their issues truly are, and really evolve into a more efficient care process. So many hospitals that are in place and struggling at this point in time are community hospitals. And, the evolution of the community hospital, the rural hospital, and now where we're at with these huge, large systems, it's just pivoted the landscape to such an extent that I think the idea of transformation, we've almost put ourselves way ahead of where we actually are as an industry. And so I'd almost say true transformation requires a step back to say, gosh, do we make somebody take a genomic test, or do we just understand their family health history better? Do we, ensure that they have access to appropriate appointment scheduling and the ability to do things in a efficient way? And then once they're within our network, how do we start to embrace them as a consumer and really push them through the network so that they feel like they are back in that community or rural-like environment where, the physician knows their name, where they're welcomed, where they can get an appointment same day. So, hopefully the answer is clear, but, I think we've, as an industry, kind of hyped up the word transformation to such an extent that, I don't know if we as an industry know what it truly means right now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective, and I couldn't agree more with that. It's easy to get swept away with these ideas and not really have these practical applications that move the needle. But you've worked across academic systems, safety net systems, rural organizations, and startups, right? The whole bandwidth there. What common leadership challenges exist across all of them?
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing in today's day and age is culture and team. When you work in a startup environment, it's not so much about the paycheck or the equity or the stock options or whatever it might be, as much as it is, about really moving the needle and working as a team to get the organization to a point of foundational strength that you can continue to build on. That sense of team, I think, is critical across any organization, especially in today's world where things change hour by hour, day by day, not month by month or quarter by quarter. And so, truly instilling a sense of team, I've found even the work that I've done with various different departments within health systems, it can be on a team by team basis, even within a broader organization, but instilling that sense of team and having, true goals, alignment to the broader goal and mission of the organization, and really having, knowing that each team member has one another's back and that we're moving in the same direction versus, everybody's going off on their own and trying to do their own thing and trying to have their own success, separate from the broader team and the broader organization. So, for me, I think instilling that within today's culture is a challenge. I think, and I think some of that is, because these organizations and these systems have gotten to be so large and so bifurcated in so many different ways that they just are not working in a hand-in-hand like process. And so I think, if I were stepping into a CEO role right now, my first effort, whether it would be at a health system, a startup, or whatever it might be, would be truly to build the right team and to really have that culture as the fundamental component of everything we're doing, aligning to a mission and pushing that organization forward.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of transformation and culture in particular. That's something I deal with a lot in this executive search world, right? Executive teams, CEOs, they want to rebuild the culture. They want to reset nursing. They want to, whatever the XYZ happens to be. And so that often means bringing in new people. New people tend to change your culture, right? And so sometimes for the better. And so people want that. And then they tend to get new leaders, and sometimes they resist it after the change. So it really is this kind of interesting balance, right? Or a tug of war between culture transformation and how do we, bring people in to transform our culture while accepting that, since change is so hard to accept for a lot of people and they tend to resist it. And one thing I do see a lot with my clients, through interims going in or just different projects that we see them working on, is that they go down these transformational roads or initiatives and they fail after the initial excitement wears off. Why do you think that is? They lose steam and that happens.
And I think technology is taken for granted in this industry. I think everybody assumes things are plug and play. The process to engaging a tech platform or engaging change within a broad environment requires a very thought-forward approach where, the communication strategy is lined out, the project management office is engaged and aware of what needs to be done, the governance structure's in place and spelled out, and all these different tasks are cascaded throughout the entirety of the organization, so everybody's well aware of the change that's going to be driven throughout the organization, so that there's really not hesitation or fear or concern with the rollout or with the adoption of specific things. And so I think a lot of why these things fail is because the process does not really begin with the end in mind. And then therefore, it's really kind of hard to push or pull it through the entirety of the organization to really truly affect things in a positive manner.
That's so interesting. From your perspective, how do leaders, really create alignment during periods of massive organizational change? You talked about the cascading, but how can people create that alignment, right, when we have so many initiatives or changes that are rolling down?
Yeah, and transparency. Transparency is critical. I think, again, I think in today's age, everybody's in fear of something, it seems like, from the CEO down through, whomever it might be within the broader organization. Everybody's afraid of some sort of change or some impact on their career, their job, whatever it might be. And so, transparency is critical. Change is never easy. Again, whether it's a startup, whether it's a 75,000 person health organization, a leadership change, any type of change is a major roadblock and a major concern with everybody in that organization. And transparency is critical to really, transparency, communication, and really having that game plan is critical to really undertaking or beginning to undertake a massive change within any organization. And, I go back to, governance structure, planning, broad communication, and really defining what those look like and ensuring that the organization broadly is aware of it.
Excellent ideas. I love that. So if you're comfortable talking about this, I wanted to ask, what lessons you may have learned while helping lead that strategic transformation and all the initiatives at JPS. Sound like it was a period of major organizational growth and campus redevelopment. Are there any lessons that you would feel comfortable sharing with us today?
Yeah, of course. I think one of the great things at JPS is we had a very solid facilities leader that really helped support every aspect of that process. By the time I got to JPS, the bond program was already 4 years in the making and in the works, and there wasn't much definition around it. And I think the hard thing was, the community had bought in. Obviously, the bond program had been voted on and accepted. There were a lot of hands in the cookie jar in that environment, whether it was county, whether it was board, various different other entities. The challenge really was that there was no plan. The plan really didn't get formed until 4 years after the fact. And at that point, it was more hurry up and try and catch up to where they were supposed to be to align not only to the projected costs and the expected deployment of specific things. So I think all in total, it was 6 years after the fact before really ground was broken and things were done. So in that instance, clearly there was not a specific game plan for going about what are we going to do with this money outside of just build a new hospital. And having to come into an organization, play to that organization, be new to the community, and then playing catch up with everything else to get to a point where we should have been probably 3 or 4 years prior really did not make it easy or enjoyable. And there were a lot of other parties involved in that equation, external third parties that were supporting from a project management perspective and from a design build perspective, et cetera, that obviously had to be brought into alignment. And then, everybody kind of have a meeting of the minds to obviously start to create a game plan for what the behavioral health building was going to look like, what the new campus was going to look like, what the various different community centers, and then how many would we have, what was that all going to look like, and how does it fit into the dollars that were allocated, and then what other partners could come to the table to help support that or make it more meaningful for that segment of Tarrant County that those environments were supporting. So that was one of those situations where, not that anybody was asleep behind the wheel, but ultimately, it seemed like it was done more in a, this is what we have to do to meet the needs of a growing community, but we don't know what it's going to look like versus here's what it's going to look like and here's why we're going to do it. And then, oh, by the way, here's what we need. So it was a little bit of putting the cart before the horse in the entirety of the whole process.
How interesting. I can only imagine how both complex building something that large would be, of course, from a planning perspective and all the decisions to be made, but also how exciting and invigorating that would be to bring that type of care and, enhanced services to the community. So, really an interesting project to be part of. Let's switch gears a little bit and discuss innovation. You mentioned a little bit about innovation. You mentioned a little AI during our conversations and the future of healthcare delivery. And I think it's interesting to explore the idea of how healthcare organizations can thoughtfully integrate innovation and technology, right? We're hearing a lot about it. AI, of course, is all the buzz in my industry as well, right? People are trying to deploy it in all sorts of ways. So I thought, as you've worked extensively in digital health and innovation strategy, where do you believe healthcare is finally starting, to get innovation right?
Yeah, and a little bit late to the game, I think, when it comes to some of the innovations that we're seeing that I believe are right. So much of this industry is person-centric, right? Not only on the consumer side, but also on the provider side. And it's very hard to supplement that in a lot of different ways. I think AI is a fundamental tool moving forward in this industry because of what it can automate and take off the hands of the folks that have a lot on their plate. And so, when I look at AI, from a human resources perspective, from a rev cycle perspective, I think it's critical to truly moving the needle and enhancing the operations in those environments. I go back to, how do we start to automate those fundamental tasks that drive better care? Again, family health history, how do we make that more of a cornerstone in the care process? I feel like we go to the ambulatory side and we go to physicians' offices, and it's something that's collected every time we go there. But how do we ingrain that more into our medical records and ensure that it's something that every physician we see or a care provider we see is well aware of what our issues, concerns might be, outside of having us do genomic testing? I go back to patient scheduling. How do we truly automate that process and ensure that it is streamlined and that, call centers aren't overburdened, that it doesn't take 20 minutes with a robotic rep to actually get something scheduled or to move through that process. Patient intake, I think, is critical. The other areas that I start to see that I'm starting to see a lot of growth in are automating other tasks, robotics. How do we have robots that actually deliver medicine, that deliver goods to rooms, that deliver products throughout the hospital? That I'm seeing more and more of, specifically overseas in other countries, but now starting to come to the U.S. Things from a kitchen perspective, can we automate rolling silverware? Well, yeah, we can, and it's starting to be done. So some of those tasks that, are not top of license necessarily for the people doing them, how do we take those off the hands of the providers and allow the providers to actually do the things that they're trained to do, they want to do, and that actually have them feeling good every day when they're leaving the hospital or wherever they're, whatever department they're serving. And so, I'm starting to see a lot more focus on those types of things. And I think, again, as I said earlier, we always see the clinical side evolve and hopefully always for the better. To see the business end start to gain some efficiencies, start to see some economies of scale, I think is critical to ultimately, again, having these institutions run more like a business.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. Areas that you mentioned there. I've been seeing that too, right? I think some early adoption of AI in areas that make sense, low lift, low cost. I've seen great success with rev cycle, denial management, short pay management, going back to the payers, just as a couple areas, in addition, of course, to dictation, right? As far as physician burnout and how can we use really just a note taker even to keep records more up to date, reduce the time and also increase accuracy, right? You could build coding into various aspects of that as well, which really helps with charge capture and making sure we're getting all the different pieces logged correctly for the payers. You've focused heavily on consumer engagement and access strategy, as we've talked about before. And I was curious, how, from your viewpoint, how has consumer expectation changed healthcare leadership, if at all, in your opinion?
I always ask this question, who owns the healthcare consumer? Is it the physician? Who do we as consumers align with? Physician, a health system, or payer, right? I mean, those are the kind of the three factors or three overarching components that go into any decision that's being made. And, I don't know that there's a right answer for any of them, right? At this point in time, I think it's more or less, where can I get in immediately, or where is my easiest access point or entry point? And then, is it going to be paid for, and to what extent? I think the factors are less, do I go to the Cleveland Clinic? Do I go to the Mayo Clinic? Do I go to Stanford? Or do I go to my local provider? Or, I think it's more, what urgent care can I go to? How can I get in today because I've got an issue? And then, what's the variable for how much I have to pay for out of pocket? So I think, if you take that into consideration, I think consumerism in healthcare has obviously made pivots into strategy and how health systems look at marketplaces and either market extenders or gap fillers, so to speak, because I think so much is about still wanting care done locally and still wanting access immediately. And, there are a couple different ways that I think it's really pivoted the system, whether it's kind of virtual first or virtual components, but then also, prevalence of urgent cares or freestanding ERs, depending on, what state and certificate of need status or whatever health systems have to go through to be able to build new. And so I think, it's had health systems really figuring out, where do I partner? What does that partnership look like? Is it bricks and mortar? Is it virtual? And to what extent can I build something out? As I referenced before, my wife's a nurse practitioner. She does telepalliative care, and so end of life care through tele. I think the industry is going to continue to evolve to, where do we take advantage of virtual components, because consumers are okay with it, because, the practice of the future is us sitting on our couch, and our smart TV, has the components within it that, hey, I need to get on a Bluetooth scale, Bluetooth blood pressure cuff, whatever it might be, to collect that data. And then, I have that appointment directly in front of my face, whether I'm sitting on my couch or whatever it might be. And so, I think, slowly but surely, we're seeing more and more of those components come into play, in addition to, is it like Starbucks where there's an urgent care on every block at this point in time?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's, a lot of what you're talking about really, and here you alluded to it, but it's kind of this idea of building systems around the consumer, right? And point of access, making things easy, not the institution itself and what's convenient for the facility, with an effort to really create this consumer-centered healthcare strategy and access. So, you repeatedly emphasize consumer-centered care models, throughout your career. But why, in your opinion, is healthcare so institution-centered?
Yeah, and I think that falls back to brand. The brand of a lot of these entities is so critical. As we rank organizations for oncology care, for cardiac care, for ortho, the brand is still critical. The brand ultimately drives the value. And so, I think that's the hard thing. How do we get beyond the brand? Do consumers, again, I go back to who owns the consumer. Does the brand matter? Does what brand the physician's tied to? Does the insurance company matter? I think from a health system perspective, the brand is critical. I think from a consumer perspective, access is critical. So it just doesn't tie up from that perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? So trying to meet in the middle by increasing that access and making it more convenient. Virtually, tele, you mentioned with your wife being a nurse practitioner. I myself have had great luck with some televisits with my physician recently, right? Just, hey, I need a quick talk. Don't really need to go all the way in, just 10 minutes of his time. And that's been really convenient. So for these people thinking about, leaders of hospitals saying, hey, gosh, I really, we should become more consumer oriented. How do we explain that? What does that look like to them? Like, how would you paint that picture of what a really consumer oriented healthcare system would look like versus what it looks like today?
And we did this a lot at the Cleveland Clinic, tried to introduce it at JPS. When you look at a consumer-centric model and when you look at an integrated care strategy, there's so many slivers and points of evolution on both those paradigms. And so truly mapping it out and not only understanding, where do I have capability within my existing network? Where do I need to drive partnerships to check a box? And then ultimately, if I put myself in the consumer's shoes, do I address the access needs of the consumers in my community? And part of that is truly knowing your marketplace and truly knowing the demographics you're dealing with, but then also ensuring that you have proper partnerships to be able to put those things into place. Now in today's society, we hear a lot about aging in place. There are studies out there that, geriatric Patients, if they see their PCP 10 times a year, the cost of care is heavily reduced and stabilized. How do you do that? You're not going to do it through in-office visits because the amount of time and the price for that is entirely too high. So you've got to have that virtual component. And I hate the term, but I think it's a critical term in today's industry, consumer segmentation strategies. A geriatric population, and their entrance point or my first touch point as a system with them through end-of-life care, what are all those touch points and am I able to check those boxes in multiple different ways? If I deal with pediatrics, where is their first access point to my system? Who's helping? How am I influencing the parent to have them access my system in the right way? And then how do I engage them throughout their care process to the point where they transition to another system or whatever that need might be? So I think it's truly understanding all the variables for the different demographics and their need, wants, demands from the system, and then my capabilities as a system of being able to address those in an integrated care model, whether through partnerships or things that I can ultimately provide to them directly. And that's where I think it really does get tricky in today's society because so many systems have cannibalized services for sake of profit. And so you can't do everything. You've got to truly have partnerships and joint ventures and a thoughtful model to really do that.
It's an interesting perspective. And one of the demographics that a lot of my clients speak about is, this idea of increasing their access to the underserved portions of their community. From your perspective, how should healthcare organizations rethink access to underserved communities as it pertains to this conversation?
That's always a tricky one and always one that can be heavily scrutinized depending on the type of organization. We had issues with that in the Cleveland Clinic with some of the neighbors within the community that we were situated in, and their ability to access even a Cleveland Clinic ER. At JPS, we had a very mindful approach to engaging that underserved community and really what our role was within that. In so many communities, FQHCs are underutilized partners. I know I think it was 2018, I partnered with a gentleman that I'd worked with at Centura Health and did a lot of due diligence in driving a consumer segmentation strategy with UCSD as they sought to expand their network and ensure that the patients were going to the right places for care. And, a lot of that boiled down to partnerships with FQHCs and what does that need to look like? I've seen health systems in outside of Chicago that have acquired FQHCs and brought them in-house, and it's taken hospitals that were operating in the negative to a positive. So, I think a lot of that too goes back to, again, when I map out, what are the demographics that I as a health system leader need to be focused on or need to understand as my consumer base? What are the needs and the wants of those communities and how do I address their care needs in the most appropriate way, but also in the most cost-effective way?
Interesting. Yeah, I love that idea of partnerships, joint ventures, using the FQHC as an arm for that. I've seen some great success with that myself. Let's switch gears a little bit again and maybe dive into leadership in complex healthcare environments. You certainly have led in some of the larger, more complex environments that there are. And this idea of leading through uncertainty, politics, growth, operational complexity, these are all top of mind. Just a lot coming at all of us these days, and so being that you've led in high complex organizations, what leadership traits matter most in healthcare today, in your opinion?
Yeah, and I've thought a lot about this question because it's I think one that's changed over the years just as rapidly as the industry's changed. I grew up with a father who was a banker who became a community hospital CEO, and then ultimately that hospital became part of the Cleveland Clinic. And so I've seen, he became a hospital CEO because he had provided the loans for a lot of the clinicians to be able to start their own practices and be able to serve the community. When I look at our healthcare leadership right now versus 20, 30, 40 years ago, I think that sense of community has slowly but surely slipped away. And I think if we look at the healthcare industry broadly, it's a service-based industry that is aligned to a specific demographic. We cannot lose sight of the fact that we're there to serve a community. And that is first and foremost and paramount to our success is doing that and doing that well and basically opening our doors to the population. And I think, as we've seen bigger brands go further and further into communities that are further and further away from their hubs, we've lost sense of that. And, I remember, I think it was 2009, I was consulting and met with the CEO of Virginia Commonwealth at that point in time. And one of the things he said is, at that point, 2009, health systems were growing drastically, much in the same way that they are now. And he said, mark my words, in 20 years, the consumer's going to wake up and say, what happened to walking into the hospital and the receptionist knows my name? Or I get a same day appointment, or my physician knows who I am, or even does house calls, or, operates in a different way. And we've lost that sense of community as we've had bigger and bigger brands go further and further into the markets that they historically did not operate in. And now we're in a day and age where we see a lot of rural healthcare providers failing. And so, the concern becomes, how much do we get further and further away from serving to it's a business. And I know I've said it before, we need to operate as a better business. And I think those, it's the complexity of healthcare. It's a service-based industry focused on communities and the well-being of those communities. But at the same time, obviously has to have fiscal responsibility and broader responsibilities. And so it's the juggling of am I a good operator, but then how am I also a good steward of community funds and being able to serve the community in the way that it needs to be served. And I think that's a delicate challenge that, and I'm not going to say every leader's lost sight of, but I think it's something that has slowly but surely started to whittle away from the industry as a whole.
Well said. Well said. Before we wrap up, thank you again for joining us on Beyond the Bedside. This conversation was an incredible look into what it truly takes to lead in healthcare. I know we just skimmed the surface of a lot of topics, innovation strategy, how we can do this through operational discipline and community partnerships, JVs and so forth. And a really deep understanding of how healthcare systems must evolve to better serve the patients themselves. I certainly appreciate your perspective on leadership, the consumer-centered care, digital transformation, and building sustainable healthcare models. It has offered really tremendous insight for leaders across every level of healthcare. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on another episode of Beyond the Bedside. If today's conversation inspired you, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with essentially anyone passionate about shaping the future of healthcare. And until next time, keep leading beyond the bedside. Mark, again, thank you so much for being a guest. It's really a pleasure talking with you a little bit today. Thank you.